The courtroom smelled like old wood and recycled air. I sat 2 rows behind my attorney, hands folded on the table, watching the light from the tall windows cut across the judge's bench in clean diagonal lines. It was nearly 11 in the morning. The hearing had been going for 40 minutes, and nothing had shifted in my favor yet. My lawyer, a woman named Patricia Helm, tapped her pen against a yellow legal pad in a rhythm I'd learned meant she was calculating odds. The rhythm was slower than usual. Across the aisle, Vanessa Clare sat with her back straight, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the witness stand. She wore a navy blazer and spoke in a voice that carried just enough tremor to suggest vulnerability without breaking composure. She'd rehearsed every line. I could see it in the way she paused before answering, in the slight tilt of her head when the judge leaned forward. She believed the truth was just performance, and she was performing beautifully. Her lawyer, a man in his 50s with silver-rimmed glasses, nodded along as she described the emotional manipulation and financial control I had allegedly wielded over her. The gallery was half full, mostly court regulars and a few people I didn't recognize. One woman in the 3rd row leaned forward whenever Vanessa's voice softened. The judge, a stern-faced man named Whitmore, listened without expression, his pen moving steadily across his notes. I didn't look angry because I wasn't. Anger had burned out months ago, replaced by something colder and more patient. I watched her the way you'd watch a chess opponent telegraphing their next 3 moves. She glanced at me once, briefly, and I saw the flicker of confidence in her eyes. She thought she'd already won. Then the door at the back of the courtroom opened. The sound was soft, just a pneumatic hiss of the hinge and the quiet click of the latch. But it cut through the room. A man stepped inside, mid-40s, wearing a gray suit and carrying a thin folder under one arm. I recognized him immediately, though I hadn't seen him in nearly 4 years. Joel Pritchard. We'd worked together once, shared an office for 2 years, stayed in touch until life and distance pulled us in separate directions. I'd told him about the case in a single phone call months ago, but I hadn't asked him to come. I hadn't asked anyone. Vanessa's gaze shifted toward the door. Her expression didn't collapse all at once. It was more like watching a mask slip 1 millimeter at a time. Her smile faded. Her shoulders stiffened. She looked back at the judge, then at her lawyer, but neither of them had noticed yet. Patricia stood. "Your Honor, I'd like to call a witness." Joel Pritchard. The judge looked up from his notes, then nodded. Joel walked down the center aisle without hurry, his shoes tapping evenly on the tile. He passed Vanessa's table, without looking at her. When he reached the stand, he raised his right hand and swore to tell the truth. His voice was calm, factual, and entirely unbothered. He opened the folder in his lap, adjusted his glasses, and looked directly at the judge. "I worked with both parties in 2021 and early 2022, he said. "I have documentation regarding several incidents the plaintiff has described inaccurately." Vanessa's lawyer stood to object, but the judge raised one hand. "I'll hear it." That's when I knew. It started 18 months earlier, in the spring when everything still looked salvageable. Vanessa and I had been partners in a small consulting firm. Nothing glamorous, just contract work for mid-sized companies that needed process optimization and compliance audits. We'd met through a mutual client, discovered we worked well together, and formalized the arrangement 6 months later. She handled client relations and proposals. I managed the technical side and documentation. For the first year, it functioned smoothly. We kept separate finances, split costs evenly, and maintained clear boundaries. I thought we understood each other. The first crack appeared in February, barely noticeable. A client mentioned receiving 2 invoices for the same deliverable, one from me, one from Vanessa, both dated the same week but with different line items. I brought it up over coffee in our shared office space, a converted loft above a print shop on Merchant Street. She laughed it off, said it was a clerical error, that she'd been rushing to meet a deadline and duplicated a template by accident. She corrected it immediately, apologized to the client, and I let it go. Mistakes happen. Then the emails started disappearing. Small things at first. Threads I knew I'd copied her on, suddenly missing from our shared project folders. A contract revision I'd sent her for review that she claimed never arrived. I checked my sent folder twice. The timestamp was there, her address in the recipient line. But when I asked her about it, she looked at me with that same bemused patience and suggested I might have forgotten to hit send. "You've been working late," she said. "Maybe you're more tired than you realize." I didn't argue. I started keeping backups. In April, I noticed my signature on a vendor agreement I'd never seen before. It was a good forgery, not perfect, but close enough that the vendor hadn't questioned it. The agreement locked us into a year-long contract with a software provider we didn't need, at a rate that drained our operating budget by 15%. I found the paperwork in the filing cabinet while looking for tax documents. When I confronted her, she was working at her desk by the window, sunlight catching the edge of her coffee mug. She didn't look up immediately. "I needed to move quickly," she said. "The vendor was offering a limited time rate. I knew you'd approve it, so I just streamlined the process. You forged my signature. I expedited a decision you would have made anyway." She finally looked at me, and her expression wasn't apologetic. It was annoyed, as though I were being petty for noticing. "We're partners, aren't we? That means acting in the business's best interest." I should have ended it there. I didn't. Instead, I became surgical. I started documenting everything, dates, times, copies of every email and message. I enabled audit logs on our shared drives. I changed my passwords and added two-factor authentication to every account. I stopped mentioning discrepancies aloud and simply recorded them in a spreadsheet I kept encrypted on a separate device. I wanted to understand what she was building toward, whether this was opportunism or something more deliberate. The answer came in June on a Thursday evening. I'd stayed late to finish a client report. Vanessa had left an hour earlier, saying she had a dinner meeting. I was alone in the office when I noticed her laptop still open on her desk, screen dimmed but not locked. I shouldn't have looked. I did anyway. Her email was open to a draft she'd been composing, not to a client, but to a lawyer. The subject line read, "Documentation of workplace misconduct." I read it standing up, my hand still on the back of her chair. She described a pattern of financial control and emotional manipulation, cited the same incidents I'd documented but inverted, making herself the victim of my alleged micromanagement and unauthorized access to business funds. She claimed I had threatened her, isolated her from clients, and created a hostile work environment. Every accusation was a distortion of something real, twisted just enough to sound plausible. At the bottom, she'd attached a timeline. It was meticulous. I took 3 photos with my phone, locked her screen, and left the office. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my apartment with the lights off, watching traffic move past a window, trying to calculate how far ahead she planned this. 2 weeks later, the formal accusation arrived at my office by courier, delivered while I was meeting with a client, opened by our receptionist, copied and forwarded to every contractor we'd worked with in the past year. The letter accused me of harassment, financial abuse, and breach of fiduciary duty. By the time I read it, half our clients had already pulled their contracts. I moved out of the shared office within 48 hours. I didn't announce it, didn't send an email explaining my side, didn't call the clients who'd gone silent. I packed my equipment into 4 cardboard boxes, laptop external drives, 2 filing cabinets worth of documents, and hired a small moving company to transport everything to a storage unit on the east side of town. The receptionist watched from her desk as I carried the last box down the stairs. She didn't say goodbye. By Monday morning, my name was off the door. I rented a 1-bedroom apartment in a complex near the interstate, the kind of place where no one asks questions and the lease runs month to month. The walls were beige, the carpet was thin, and the kitchen had exactly 4 cabinets. I didn't hang anything on the walls. I set up my desk in the corner of the living room, positioned so I could see the parking lot through the window, and arranged my files in chronological order on a folding table I'd bought from a hardware store. Every document had a date. Every email had a timestamp. I labeled folders by incident type: financial discrepancies, signature forgery, client communication, timeline documentation. I didn't do this out of rage. I did it because silence required structure, and structure required evidence that could stand without emotion. For the first 2 weeks, I didn't speak to anyone outside of necessary transactions. Grocery clerks, the landlord, my attorney when I finally hired one. I ignored calls from former colleagues who wanted to know what really happened. I deleted voicemails from mutual acquaintances suggesting I clear the air or reach out to Vanessa to work things out. They meant well, but they didn't understand. Clearing the air required assuming good faith, and good faith had become a liability I couldn't afford. I kept my communications with Vanessa limited to email, and every message was copied to my lawyer before I sent it. I wrote in the language of procedure: per your request dated June 14th, I am providing notice that I will no longer be participating in joint client meetings. All outstanding project obligations will be fulfilled according to the terms outlined in our partnership agreement, Section 4.2. No anger, no accusation, no defense. Just terms and dates and contractual references. She responded once, briefly, suggesting we talk this through like adults. I didn't answer. My lawyer, Patricia Helm, was a woman in her early 50s with graying hair pulled back in a tight bun and a manner that suggested she'd stopped being surprised by human behavior sometime in the previous decade. We met in her office on a Wednesday afternoon, and I brought 3 binders of documentation. She paged through them methodically, occasionally making notes on a yellow pad, her expression unchanging. After 20 minutes, she looked up. "This is very thorough," she said, almost compulsive. "Is that a problem?" "No, it's useful." She closed the binder and folded her hands on the desk. "But you need to understand something. Documentation proves you're organized. It doesn't prove you're innocent. A jury or a judge will decide that based on whether your story makes sense and whether hers falls apart. Right now, her story is simpler and more sympathetic. We need to complicate it." I nodded. I'd expected this. "Do you have any witnesses?" she asked. "Anyone who worked with both of you, saw the dynamic firsthand, can corroborate your version?" I thought about it. Most of our contractors have been remote, communicating by email or video call. The receptionist had only worked part-time and had been hired by Vanessa. The clients had already chosen sides or gone silent. There was one person, Joel Pritchard, a colleague from my previous job who'd visited the office a few times, who'd seen the way Vanessa operated, who'd even joked once about her talent for creative interpretation after a particularly strained client meeting. But Joel had moved to another state, started a new position, and we hadn't spoken in over a year. I didn't want to pull him into this. "No," I said. "No witnesses." Patricia made a note. Then we build the case on paper. Contracts, emails, financial records, timestamps. We demonstrate pattern and motive. It's slower, but it's reliable. I left her office and drove back to the apartment. I stopped at a diner on the way, ordered coffee I didn't finish, and sat in a booth near the window watching traffic thin as the afternoon faded. My phone buzzed once. A text from Joel, oddly timed, as though he'd sensed something shifting. It was brief. "Heard you're dealing with some stuff. Let me know if you need anything." I read it twice, typed a response, then deleted it. I didn't need anything except time and evidence. That night, I hung a calendar on the wall above my desk. I circled the hearing date in red marker, August 23rd, for months away, and pinned the corner with a thumbtack. It was the only decoration in the apartment. I let myself look at it once a day, no more. Everything else was documentation and waiting. I became very good at both. The preparation phase began in early July, when the heat settled over the city like a weight, and the air conditioner in my apartment rattled constantly, but never quite cooled the room. I met with Patricia twice a week, always at her office, always in the late afternoon, when the building was quieter and the receptionist had gone home. We worked through the case in layers, peeling back each of Vanessa's claims and identifying the points where a narrative bent away from documentation. She'd accused me of controlling business finances. We pulled bank statements showing equal access, and equal withdrawals. She claimed I had isolated her from clients. We compiled a list of every meeting she'd attended, every proposal she'd written, every call log showing her direct contact with contractors. She described a pattern of emotional manipulation. We built a timeline of our communications, every email neutral and professional, every text message brief and transactional. Patricia arranged the evidence in binders color-coded by category: blue for financial records, green for client correspondence, yellow for internal communications, red for contractual documents. The judge will want to see coherence, Patricia said during one session, tapping her pen against a spreadsheet I created tracking invoice discrepancies. Not just individual pieces of evidence, but a pattern that contradicts her version. We're not trying to prove you're a good person. We're proving her story doesn't hold up under scrutiny. I understood. This wasn't about character. It was about logical consistency and documentation that couldn't be argued away. I spent evenings at my desk cross-referencing dates, highlighting contradictions in the statements Vanessa had submitted to her lawyer, building spreadsheets that mapped her accusations against verifiable facts. When she claimed I had threatened her during a meeting on March 15th, I found the email thread showing I had been in another city that day, attending a conference with registration records and a hotel receipt. When she described unauthorized account access, I pulled audit logs showing her own access patterns, including 2 instances where she'd log into accounts at 2 a.m, hours I'd never worked. The work was methodical and occasionally numbing. I developed routines to stay sharp. Morning walks before the heat became unbearable, lunch at the same diner where I could sit and think without distraction, evenings dedicated to one category of evidence at a time. I stopped checking social media. I stopped reading news. I allowed myself exactly one distraction per day: a book, a documentary, something unrelated to case, and then returned to the files. In late July, Joel called. I almost didn't answer. I was in the middle of reviewing vendor contracts, and the interruption felt like a small betrayal of the focus I'd been maintaining. But I picked up on the 4th ring. "I know you said you didn't need anything," he said, "but I'm going to be in town next week for a conference. Thought I'd check in, maybe buy you dinner." I hesitated. The truth was, I hadn't told him the full scope of what was happening, just that there'd been a business dispute and I was handling it legally. I didn't want to burden him with details, didn't want to risk pulling him into something that might complicate his own professional life. But there was something in his tone, a quiet insistence, that made me reconsider. We met at a steakhouse near the convention center, a place with dim lighting and enough ambient noise that conversation stayed private. Joel looked older than I remembered, more gray at the temples, deeper lines around his eyes, but his manner was the same, direct and unhurried. We talked about his work first, his new position managing a consulting team in Denver, the differences between corporate culture there and here. Then he asked about the case. I gave him the abbreviated version. The accusations, the legal process, the hearing scheduled for late August. I kept my tone factual, clinical. He listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding, his expression difficult to read. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, turning his water glass slowly on the table. "I was in your office 3 times that spring," he said finally. "I saw how she operated. The way she'd reframe conversations, shift responsibility, smile while she did it. I remember thinking you were more patient than I would have been." He looked up. "If you need someone to verify that, what the dynamic actually looked like, I can do that." I kept notes from those visits, meeting summaries, observations. I document everything. I felt something shift, a small recalibration of possibilities. I hadn't expected this. I'd built the entire strategy around paper evidence, around the assumption that testimony would be limited to Vanessa and me. 2 competing narratives with no third party to break the tie. "You'd be willing to testify?" I asked. "If it helps, yes." I didn't commit immediately. I told him I'd discuss it with Patricia, that I'd let him know. But driving back to the apartment that night, I felt the first quiet edge of something that wasn't quite hope, but was close, a sense that the structure I'd been building might hold after all. I added his contact information to the case file, labeled a potential witness, and placed it in the red binder. Then I looked at the calendar on the wall, the circled date now just 4 weeks away, and allowed myself to imagine what it might look like when truth finally had a voice that wasn't mine. The courtroom felt smaller the second time Joel spoke. He'd been on the stand for over 12 minutes, his voice steady and unhurried, walking the judge through his observations from the spring of 2022. He described 3 separate visits to our office, each one documented in his work calendar and corroborated by meeting notes he'd filed with his own company. He explained that he'd been consulting with us on a potential partnership project, which required him to observe our operational dynamics and assess whether our firm could handle the technical requirements. During the first visit in March, Joel said, I witnessed Ms. Claire redirect a client question about billing discrepancies. The client had received 2 invoices for the same deliverable. Ms. Claire suggested the error was due to Mr. Brennan's. He glanced at me briefly. The defendant's system malfunctioned, but I'd seen the original invoice the day before. The duplicate had been generated from her terminal, not his. Vanessa's lawyer, a man named Richard Cosgrove, stood immediately. Your Honor, the witness is speculating about technical details he couldn't possibly verify. Joel didn't wait for the judge's response. He opened the folder in his lap and removed a single sheet of paper. I took a photograph of the computer screen that day. The metadata is visible in the bottom corner. Username, timestamp, terminal ID. It's all here. Patricia stood and approached the bench. Your Honor, we'd like to enter this as Exhibit J1. Judge Whitmore examined the photograph, his expression unreadable. He handed it to the clerk, then nodded to Joel. Continue. Joel described a second visit in April, when he'd arrived early for a meeting and found Vanessa alone in the office, accessing my files without authorization. She didn't know I was there at first, he said. I'd let myself in with the key code she'd given me the week before. She was at Mr. Brennan's desk, going through his filing cabinet. When she noticed me, she said she was looking for a contract we needed for the meeting. But the meeting was about a completely different client. Did you mention this to Mr. Brennan? Patricia asked. Not immediately. I didn't think it was my place to interfere in their business operations. But I noted it in my records in case it became relevant later. He paused. It became relevant when I learned about these accusations. Vanessa sat rigid in her chair, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her expression had shifted from confident composure to something harder to define. Not panic, exactly, but a visible effort to maintain control. She leaned toward Cosgrove and whispered something. He shook his head slightly, a gesture that seemed more resigned than strategic. Joel moved to the third visit. In early May, the week before I discovered the draft email on Vanessa's laptop. He'd been present for a client call where Vanessa had misrepresented the status of a deliverable, claiming I'd failed to complete work that I'd actually finished and submitted days earlier. The client was frustrated. Joel said. Ms. Claire positioned it as though Mr. Brennan had dropped the ball, said she'd been covering for his disorganization for months. But I'd reviewed the deliverable myself. It was complete and on schedule. I asked her about it after the call, and she said she'd misspoken, that she confused it with a different project. But the client's name was on the screen the entire time. There was no confusion. Patricia let the statement sit for a moment before asking her next question. In your professional opinion, based on these observations, did Mr. Brennan exhibit behavior consistent with the accusations Ms. Claire's made, financial control, emotional manipulation, creating a hostile work environment? Joel's answer was immediate and unequivocal. No. If anything, he was too accommodating. He let things slide that should have been addressed directly. I told him that once, actually told him he needed to document everything, because the dynamic felt unstable. He said he was handling it. Did you believe him? Not entirely, but it wasn't my business to push. Joel looked at the judge. I wish I had. Cosgrove stood for cross-examination, his tone sharp and confrontational. He questioned Joel's motives, suggested the notes were fabricated after the fact, implied that Joel's friendship with me had biased his testimony. Joel answered every question with the same measured calm, referring back to dates, files, and records that predated the accusations by months. When Cosgrove tried to suggest a photograph had been altered, Joel provided the original digital file's metadata, showing the creation date and camera model. When Cosgrove questioned why Joel hadn't come forward sooner, Joel's response was simple: "I wasn't asked." And frankly, I hoped they'd resolve it without litigation. When I learned there was a hearing, I contacted Mr. Brennan's attorney and offered to provide what I knew. The cross-examination lasted 15 minutes and accomplished nothing. Cosgrove sat down looking faintly exhausted. Judge Whitmore made a note, then looked at Patricia. "Any redirect?" "No, Your Honor. The witness has been clear." Joel stepped down from the stand and returned to his seat in the gallery. He didn't look at me as he passed, but I saw the slight tension in his shoulders ease once he sat down. The hardest part was over. Patricia called me to the stand next, but my testimony was brief, mostly verification of the documents we'd already submitted, confirmation of dates and transactions. The judge asked 3 questions, all procedural. I answered in the same flat, factual tone I maintained throughout the entire process. No emotion, no appeal for sympathy, just facts and records and the truth as I could document it. When Cosgrove cross-examined me, he tried to paint me as calculating, as someone who'd orchestrated the entire documentation process to build a false defense. "You kept meticulous records," he said, his tone accusatory, almost as if he were planning for this. "I kept records because discrepancies kept appearing," I said. "I needed to understand what was happening. That's not planning, it's responding, or creating a narrative. The documents speak for themselves." Judge Whitmore called a brief recess. I sat in the hallway outside the courtroom, not speaking, not checking my phone, just watching the light shift across the tile floor. Patricia sat beside me, reviewing her notes. After 10 minutes, we were called back in. The judge's decision was delivered without preamble. He found Vanessa's claims unsupported by credible evidence, noted multiple inconsistencies in her testimony, and referenced Joel's documentation as compelling corroborating material that undermines the plaintiff's narrative. The case was dismissed. Costs were awarded to the defense. I didn't react. I stood when instructed, shook Patricia's hand, and walked out of the courtroom into bright afternoon heat. Vanessa and Cosgrove left through a side exit. I didn't watch them go. I didn't need to win back my name. The truth had done it for me. 3 years have passed since that afternoon in Judge Whitmore's courtroom. I live in a different city now, a smaller place 2 states west where the pace is slower and people don't ask complicated questions about your past. I teach process management at a community college, 3 classes per semester, and consult part-time for a firm that values precision over client relations. The work is steady, unspectacular, and entirely mine. My apartment overlooks a park where I walk most mornings before the heat sets in. The walls are still mostly bare, but I've hung a few things: a framed photograph of mountains I visited last summer, a print I bought at a street market, a calendar that I no longer circle in red. I never heard from Vanessa again. Patricia told me, months after the hearing, that she'd moved to a different state and was working under a slightly modified professional name. I didn't ask for details. Whatever reconstruction she's building, it's no longer connected to me, and that's sufficient. Joel and I exchange messages a few times a year, usually around holidays or when one of us changes jobs. He never made a big deal out of the testimony, never asked for gratitude or acknowledgement beyond a brief dinner we shared the night after the hearing. We talked about other things that evening: his work in Denver, a hiking trip he was planning, a book he'd recommended. When we said goodbye in the parking lot, he shook my hand and said, "Something's had to be said." That was all. He still signs his holiday cards the same way. Something's had to be said. Jay. I don't think about the case often anymore. It exists now as a chapter that closed cleanly, without loose threads or unresolved grievances. Occasionally, I'll see someone in a courtroom drama on television, watch them shout or break down or deliver some cathartic speech, and I'll feel a distant recognition of how different the real version was. Quieter, slower, built on document and timestamps rather than emotional revelation. There's no satisfaction in that kind of justice, not the way people imagine it. Just relief and distance, and the knowledge that the truth held when it mattered. I'm writing this now because someone asked me recently if I'd ever been wrongly accused of something, and I said yes, and they wanted to know how it resolved. I gave them the abbreviated version, and they seemed disappointed that it wasn't more dramatic. I understood. The story doesn't have a villain's downfall or a hero's triumph. It has paperwork and patience, and a friend who showed up when the truth needed a second voice. That's enough. It was always enough. I still keep good records. Not out of fear, but out of habit. Some lessons stay with you longer than the circumstances that taught them. And some debts, like the one I owe to a man who didn't have to drive 6 hours to tell the truth in a borrowed courtroom, can only be repaid by remembering that silence sometimes is the loudest lie of all.